From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide. Welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew.
The road to the White House runs through the Midwest today as the Harris Walz ticket visits Wisconsin and Michigan to court the union vote, with J.D. Vance holding counter events in the same locations. We're joined by former Deputy Labor Secretary Seth Harris on the fight for organized labor.
A second member of the squad is taken out in a primary challenge. Congresswoman Cori Bush of Missouri following in the path of Jamal Bowman after a pro-Israel group spends millions to defeat her.
And the U.S. pushes military assets closer to Israel to help defend against an attack by Iran, as Hamas names an architect of the October 7th terror attacks as its new political leader. We'll have the latest with Hagar Chemali of Greenwich Media Strategies.
The freshly named Harris Walz ticket campaigning together on the road today, Eau Claire, Wisconsin, before heading later this evening to a rally in Detroit.
You came here for one beautiful, simple reason. You love this country and this democracy. I couldn't be prouder to be on this ticket.
Walz and Harris, of course, not the only ones in the Midwest today. In a suburb of Detroit, Republican vice presidential nominee J.D. Vance took aim at his opponent.
This is a radical human being who comes from the far left wing of the Democrat Party. And what Kamala Harris is telling all of us by selecting Tim Walz is that she bends the knee to the far left of the Democrat Party. She's done it every single time in government. She's done it in who she selected as her VP nominee. And she will do it if the American people give her a promotion to President of the United States.
Joining us now for more is Bloomberg politics reporter Gregory Cordy. So, Gregory, obviously they are in the same states. They are in many ways trying to court the exact same voters, as both have taken aim at unions specifically. But it is Harris and Walz that are going to be with the UAW in Detroit this evening. And it was Tim Walz who was welcomed by organized labor, it seemed, yesterday with a slew of endorsements after he was announced as Harris's pick.
Yeah, this is all along been sort of the blue Walz candidate, right? And Tim Walz, really having that sort of Midwestern football coach kind of vibe that really sort of plays well in the industrial North, which is where Joe Biden's strength was, which is, you know, as we all know, we've been talking about for the last 8 years, critical to Democratic fortunes. And it's no coincidence that the first place that they tried to deploy him is in those three states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. And it's also no coincidence that J.D. Vance showed up on a tarmac to greet the Harris Walz ticket as they arrived in Eau Claire, because he's there to do the exact same thing.
And he's going to continue following them throughout the week. Blue Walz, by the way. Did you come up with that? That's
I
very
did, just at the spur of the moment.
That was fantastic. I'm going to steal that. So he speaks to the Rust Belt, but we've been hearing about her opening a path, when I say her, Kamala Harris, in the Sun Belt states. Does his message land the same way there?
That's what it will be interesting to see. I think I think the divisions that the geographic distinctions that we tend to make in terms of these states are very different from other states. Look, you have blue collar workers in every state in the union. You have football fans in every state of the union. So we're talking about the relative strengths and relative weaknesses. I think Kamala Harris at the top of the ticket does very well in those states like Georgia and Arizona, very diverse states, ethnically diverse, but also, a growing sort of suburban population there that I think she appeals to as well.
Well, while J.D. Vance was on the road today, he had a kind of spur-of-the-moment press conference, it seemed, in which a number of things were said, including this idea that he thinks he may still be on for a debate against Kamala Harris in just a few days on August 13th. That was, of course, what Harris invited him to back in July when she still was the vice presidential nominee. I'm assuming that's not going to happen, Gregory, but I just have a lot of questions as to whether or not we're actually going to see a vice presidential debate or a presidential one, as Trump on Fox and Friends this morning suggested that they are going to have one.
Honestly, I can't quite keep track. This seems to be a continuation of the line of attack that Trump had, in trying to not commit to a debate with Kamala Harris because he said he committed to Biden, and now it's changed. But now you have J.D. Vance saying that he doesn't want to debate Tim Walz because he still wants to debate Kamala. I don't know who's debating whom. It might be a round robin of some kind. We'll just have to see. But this is very unusual. What happened when we blew up this whole debate structure that we've had in this country for 40, 50 years, where the Commission on Presidential Debate has 3 regularly scheduled debates with a preset format that we all very predictable. And we all sort of gotten used to, and then for whatever reason, the 2 candidates decided to blow that up. And so now everything's up for grabs, including the debate over whether we're going to have a debate.
Let us know when you find out. The invite
absolutely will.
The invite stands here on Balance of Power. We're going to make that happen real easy on Bloomberg TV and radio. Gregory Cordy, we thank you so much as we turn our attention to the results from primary day. Congresswoman Cori Bush lost her primary battle in Missouri to St. Louis County prosecuting attorney Wesley Bell. Bush, a member of the squad, so-called, responding to her defeat in a fiery address to supporters.
Because see, now I don't have to worry about some strings that I have attached, and as much as I love my job. But all they did was radicalize me, and so now they need to be afraid.
Let's bring in Bloomberg's Megan Scully for more on this. It was the race that most of us were watching in a night that had 4 states in play. But as I mentioned, the second member of the squad to go down in defeat. How much did this have to do with the Israel issue, the remarkable amount of spending from AIPAC in the state versus her own districts and her own challenges?
It had everything to do with AIPAC and pro-Israeli PACs who pumped millions into this race. The local economy was the #1 issue during this campaign in the St. Louis area district that also includes Ferguson and some other areas where there are a lot of low-income voters. But just the sheer amount of cash that was put in to support Wesley Bell really pulled him to the top of the ticket, even though Israel itself was not the primary issue.
Well, so it does seem we're seeing something of a pattern here. Cori Bush, Jamal Bowman, of course, before her. Ilhan Omar has a primary in Minnesota coming up next week. Does she have reason to be very concerned right now?
So there has not been a ton of money from AIPAC and other affiliated organizations that have been poured into that race yet. They tried and failed, not to the extent that they did with Bowman and with Bush yesterday, but they tried and failed in 2022 and she's facing the same challenger on Tuesday. So we'll see. Perhaps AIPAC has a lot of money that it has said it will spend on these elections. So we'll see if they do a last-minute dump of cash in that district. She only won by 2 percentage points last time, which is a lot less. Cori Bush in the last election walked away with that, overwhelmingly in the primary. So it will be one to watch next week, particularly as we're getting closer and closer to the DNC.
To what extent will AIPAC play a role in the general election? So
in total, they have said that they were planning to spend, I think, somewhere upwards of $90 million, which is a significant amount of cash, particularly when you're talking about some of these congressional elections. The issue of Israel nationwide is going to continue to be a top issue for debate. We'll see it if we ever do see a debate between the major candidates. And we saw it even in Kamala Harris's selection of her vice presidential pick. There were a lot of concerns about Shapiro and him being too pro-Israel and, what that meant for progressives. So it's going to continue to be a topic that it particularly divides Democrats and will be an issue to watch. So we'll see. But I will be watching that Omar race very closely next week.
Yeah, we all will. And, of course, we'll have it covered here on Balance of Power. Just finally, Megan, of course, it does remind us that it is not just about the presidential race, that there is the balance of Congress to consider. Is there a prevailing thought among either the Republican conference or Democratic caucus on Capitol Hill that the selection of Tim Walz as Harris's running mate has any ripple effect down the ballot in terms of Democrats being able to flip the House, for example?
So I think in general, since Kamala Harris became top of the ticket, that the House has become very much more optimistic for Democrats because you have this sort of enthusiasm, and it's going to come down to a race to get out the vote, particularly in New York and the Hudson Valley and in Southern California districts. These are blue states, and these are purple pockets in blue states, but where there are, between the two states, about 10 Republicans who are in tough reelection fights. If Harris and Walz can really mobilize Democrats and independents in those districts, the House can be won just in those two pockets by Democrats.
All right, Bloomberg's Megan Scully, who leads our congressional coverage. Thank you so much. And coming up, we'll have more on the Democratic ticket's effort to court unions. Seth Harris, former U.S. Deputy Secretary of Labor, will join us next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
J.D. Vance can say what he wants to say, but I think if you compare the records of the Biden-Harris administration and then what the Trump administration did last time they were in power and what they've told us they're going to do next time, it's bad news for working people, whether they're in a union or not.
That was Sharon Block, Executive Director for the Center of Labor at Harvard Law School earlier today. She, of course, worked in this administration. Joining us now for more is Seth Harris. He is former Deputy U.S. Secretary of Labor and Senior Fellow at the Burns Center, here with us on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. So, Seth, I'm sure you agree with what we just heard from Sharon. But this notion that especially the selection of Tim Walz is a pro-union selection, that this ticket is going to be pro-labor, does that just mean continuity with what has already happened under the Biden-Harris administration? Or does that mean that this potential future administration is going to go even further? Can you go further?
Well, that's an interesting question. Governor Walz has been able to accomplish a number of things that were on the Biden-Harris agenda but were blocked by Republicans in Congress. For example, paid family and medical leave. He also succeeded in banning captive anti-union meetings that employers hold in order to defeat a union organizing drive. He was able to get an extended child tax credit that's one of the most generous in the country. And he is himself a union member, and his wife is a union member. So I think that there are more opportunities for the administration to support workers if they choose to organize and support collective bargaining around the country. But having someone who has lived it and is a strong supporter of unions and has been successful in legislating to produce pro-union outcomes, pro-worker outcomes, yeah, I think that there's a lot more opportunity at the federal level.
As governor of Minnesota, Seth, I'm sure you know Tim Walz vetoed a bill that would have raised the minimum wage for Uber and Lyft drivers, gig workers, essentially, disappointing some of the progressives in his state. He did suggest that there should be a minimum wage, a higher wage for them, but didn't think that was the right time to do it. Should he have to explain that?
Well, he should, but I think his explanation is very simply going to be that after he vetoed that legislation, he put a commission in place to study the issues, to bring the parties together and to come up with a piece of legislation that they could all support. This is an issue that's plagued governors and also has divided the labor movement all around the country. But it's the exception to the generalized rule that Tim Walz is a very strongly pro-worker, pro-union governor. I think he's in the conversation for most pro-union, most pro-worker governor in the country. And he's got some pretty stiff competition, including among the other vice presidential candidates, Shapiro and Pritzker, and some of the others. So I don't think that issue is going to get in the way. He'll be asked about it, I'm sure, and I'm interested to hear what he has to say about it.
Well, as we consider what credentials Walz brings or what ultimately leadership seems to think about him within these unions. We've heard positive feedback from Sean Fain of the UAW, who, of course, will be with him and the vice president in Detroit this evening. Other union leadership has endorsed him as well. Union membership, though, as we've seen in the case of Donald Trump, can be a very different thing, Seth. Especially auto workers seem to be trending more toward Donald Trump. Can Tim Walz be the one that brings them back toward the Democratic side? How does he do that?
Yeah, let me just say, I don't think there's any evidence that auto workers are trending towards Donald Trump. In every union, there are Republicans and there are Trump supporters. By the way, not necessarily the same sized group in unions. But as I talk to union political directors and talk to union leaders around the country, the level of enthusiasm for the Harris Walz campaign, the Harris Walz candidacy, is really overwhelming. There were a lot of people who were, frankly, quite worried about whether or not President Biden would be able to defeat Donald Trump. And as Sharon mentioned in your setup piece, there are really bitter memories of what the Trump administration meant for unions and meant for workers. And so there was real dejection among some frontline union members, frontline leaders, and also some national folks. But with the transition from President Biden to Vice President Harris and the renewed support of unions for their candidacy, and also seeing her pick of a very strongly pro-union vice presidential candidate, the level of enthusiasm has absolutely gone through the roof. There are more volunteers, more PAC contributions, more people who had said, oh, I don't want to go to the Democratic National Convention, who are now bothering their national leadership, trying to get tickets, trying to get credentials, trying to figure out where the good parties are going to be. So I think that there's been a dramatic change. I can tell you that, again, in my conversations with political union directors, union political directors, national union political directors, that they think that there could be an even higher union membership vote for Vice President Harris than there was for President Biden. And he won 56% of the votes from people who are in union households. So that would make a gigantic difference. And I think Governor Walz is going to make a difference in the upper Midwest, in the industrial areas. He's the kind of guy that they are comfortable with, and I think that he'll be able to bring a lot of them home to the Democratic Party.
Seth, if Kamala Harris wins this election, should she re-nominate Julie Su to be Labor Secretary?
You know, I'm gonna leave later questions for later, Joe. I know you want me to get on the record on some of these things, but I'm gonna wait on those kinds of questions until we know. I'm a tremendous fan of.
Doesn't she deserve to be re-nominated after not getting a vote?
I think she's fantastic. I think it's a shame that she didn't get a vote, and I think it was a shame that she has not been confirmed. She's done a terrific job, and I'm a huge fan of hers. But I think it's a little early to be picking cabinet secretaries. There's an election to be won. Let's see how that comes out first.
All right, we're ready to play that game with you anytime you want. A very careful Seth Harris. It's great to see you, as always, Seth. Former U.S. Deputy Labor Secretary. Great to have you back, and we'll see you in Chicago. Coming up, we'll look at what the Harris ticket means to the U.S. neighbors to our north. Matthew Winkler, Bloomberg News Editor-in-Chief Emeritus, joining us next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Thanks for joining us. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons in Washington. As the election ramps up here in the U.S., there will likely be effects for the United States neighbors. And Bloomberg News Editor-in-Chief Emeritus Matthew Winkler's latest column focuses on how the newly invigorated Democratic Party in the U.S. might provide some solace to Canada's Prime Minister and his Liberal Party. Joining us now, indeed, Bloomberg's Matthew Winkler. Great to have you back, sir. Connect the dots for us to the north.
So great to be with you. And the dots are these. He is yet another global leader enveloped by flagging polls. There really isn't anyone in the G7 who is doing that well. And Justin Trudeau is no exception. He's been governing now for more than 8 years. And actually, he's got the second best performing economy in the G7 after the U.S., and that's a first. No prime minister has come close to matching his economic or economy And that's manifest in a number of ways. Exports coming from Canada are a powerhouse after the renegotiation of NAFTA that he did with, at the time, a very truculent President Trump. And what he has done mostly is change the trajectory of Canada by welcoming immigrants more so than any of his recent predecessors, to the extent that Canada really doesn't have the demographic issue or problem that developed countries have, because its population is growing robustly at this point, and that's all due to Democrats. Now, what does Kamala Harris do for him? Well, many of her policies are very much the policies that Justin Trudeau initiated when he became prime minister in 2015. He made his cabinet for the first time gender balanced, as many women in the cabinet as men. That had never happened before. He made the Supreme Court of Canada more women than men because of 6 consecutive appointments. He legalized cannabis, so that's a lot of revenue going forward for future governors and governments. And he really brought Canada into the 21st century with technology by making technology one of the most important industries in corporate Canada.
Well, and you have all these statistics on the extent to which Canada has seen growth and trade expand under Trudeau's leadership. But we've seen a lot of growth in the U.S. as well under President Biden. He's always struggled to get credit for it. Can Trudeau claim the credit in the same way, make it resonate with actual voters in Canada?
Well, let's put it this way. If the Democratic Party under Kamala Harris now shows signs of gaining popularity, which it does already in less than 2 weeks, Canadians are going to start paying attention to their bigger neighbor. And the Democrats are clearly going to run on what they've done. And so what you're going to hear from the Harris campaign is, in fact, what it has achieved with unemployment consecutive lows since the 1960s. Inflation has returned almost back to where the Fed wants it to be. The U.S. has done more to narrow the gap between rich and poor under the past 3.5 years. All of those things are going to be Democratic, if you will, issues that they're going to highlight. And that's exactly what Trudeau has done. So Canadians are going to get, if you will, a ringside seat to what they've been living through themselves over the past 8 years.
All right, Matthew Winkler, Bloomberg Editor-in-Chief Emeritus, thank you so much, as always, for joining us, sir. You can find his Bloomberg opinion piece on the terminal and online. And still ahead, a look at the Middle East as the world waits for Iran's response to Israel's killing of Hamas's political chief in Tehran last week. Hagar Chemali of Greenwich Media Strategies and former director for Syria and Lebanon at the National Security Council is next here on Bloomberg TV and Radio.
I think that any Jewish person who votes for a Democrat, or in this case these people, but who votes for a Democrat, should have their head examined. They are so bad. If you look, they are so bad to Jewish people. Everyone thought it was going to be Shapiro. It turned out not to be Shapiro. I have very little doubt that it was, not for the reason we're talking about. It was because of the fact that he's Jewish.
Donald Trump saying it all out loud earlier today on Fox News, where he doubled down, or I guess tripled down here, on what has become a growing refrain from the right on anti-Semitism among Democrats. Not just the choice of a running mate to exclude Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania, but overall Israeli policy. And joining us now is Hagar Chemali, the founder and CEO of Greenwich Media Strategies, former director for Syria and Lebanon at the National Security Council. Hagar, welcome back. It's always a pleasure to spend time with you. Pull us in off the ledge here, because this conversation is growing louder. And we've been hearing Donald Trump say this, J.D. Vance say this as well. Anti-Semitic to choose Tim Walz. You can't trust Kamala Harris because she is not looking out for Jewish people. But the last we checked, she was married to one. Hagar, how do you interpret all of this?
To be honest, let's start from the beginning. I'm going to start by placing the blame on those on the far left and the loud pro-Palestinian voices that were making Josh Shapiro himself answer for himself, and something that they would have never done to a Jewish leader in general, right? Where he really had to come out there repeatedly on his positions and on his faith, and that's not fair and that's not American. And that's something that ended up being a gift for Republicans. It was just a gift that was thrown into Trump's lap, and to further perpetuate that he wasn't chosen for anti-Semitic reasons is not fair, and it's ugly because, first of all, there's no reason to believe that, other than the fact that this was put out there in the press, and that Shapiro himself had to keep answering for this. But also, it undermines our own American values, our own morals, and also how we look abroad. If this kind of idea that this is why he wasn't chosen is understood by the Middle East, by those abroad, then that's something they're going to think is something that's acceptable, that anti-Semitism is acceptable, that it is here in the United States strong and well from the very top. And I will say one last point, which is that I really do think, as a communications person, when you don't shape the narrative, others are going to shape it for you. And it is critical, it is incumbent on Vice President Harris to go out there and set the record straight and explain, no, that is not why she didn't choose him, and offer as many details as she can. Otherwise, this story is going to keep being repeated, particularly by Trump and Vance.
Well, and Hagar, it's not just accusations of anti-Semitism. It's specifically this idea of an anti-Israel sentiment. And some people are pointing to the much more pointed remarks we heard from the vice president after her meeting with Netanyahu here in Washington last month. This idea that she may be pushing even harder for a ceasefire. Is pushing for a ceasefire in and of itself an anti-Israel position, or is a ceasefire actually in Israeli interest? Are we missing the point here?
No, well, so I believe that a ceasefire is in Israel's interest, of course, but there is a gap between Israel's goals, the goals of the Netanyahu government, and the U.S. goals in this war. The U.S. goals are to reach a ceasefire, to get the hostages released, to defeat Hamas's military and governing capabilities, and to quickly pivot to some kind of deal with Saudi Arabia and others so that they can look ahead to the future, to a two-state solution and to the rebuilding of Gaza, which is a great goal, but very far-fetched from where we're standing at the moment. Israel's goals are to significantly defeat, if not eradicate, these terrorist groups. And Hamas is not the only one. They are also looking at Hezbollah and other Iran-backed groups. And that's why you're seeing them pursue this policy of killing terrorist leaders. That is a common counterterrorism policy that, by the way, not only Israel chooses that policy, but the U.S., UK, France. France is the one that arguably started that counterterrorism objective by, dismantling them and their capabilities by targeting the leaders. And so when you have that gap, all of that, discussing that, figuring out whether you prefer a ceasefire or you're going to hold off on a ceasefire has nothing to do with anti-Semitism or being pro or anti-Israel. It's really just a different means to an end. And the U.S. deeply believes, and I would agree, that reaching a ceasefire now and that Hamas has been significantly defeated at the moment does help Israel secure itself in the long term. And that's what the U.S. wants to see. But again, the Israeli government does have different goals, and they want to get all those terrorist leaders when they can.
Well, Hagar, the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, is talking with Arab capitals officials who we have relationships with to help to avoid a retaliatory strike or series of strikes by Iran against Israel. Yesterday, we spoke with Michael Allen, the managing director at Beacon Global Strategies, who said this is not likely something that you can stop. Let's listen.
I think for their own sake, their own deterrence, their own toughness in the region, and the appearance that they need to give to their proxies, they have to do something. The Iranians want to do it differently than last time. Last time everything was intercepted. I think they actually want to feel like they landed a punch this time.
What would it look like in this case to land a punch, Hagar?
Well, so let me tell you what we know. We know that Iran is planning some kind of coordinated attack, according to the Biden administration, planning a coordinated attack with all of its proxies. So Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, Hamas in Gaza, and probably the West Bank and other groups in Syria. And by pursuing something coordinated, it means that they're likely going to go around Israel from every angle. And when you overwhelm a system like the Iron Dome, even when the U.S. is there helping, and by the way, Saudi Arabia and Jordan have also pledged that they will help because they don't want missiles flying over their airspace. then the fact is when you overwhelm a system, you're going to have a greater chance of something getting in. And Iran did say that they want to punish Israel. And they relayed a message through Hungary saying that they will attack Israel, but also that they don't want a full-scale war. Now, listen, I'm not going to sugarcoat this for you. We are already in some kind of low-grade war, and the U.S. is already dragged in it. If we have already intercepted missiles, we are already in the Red Sea attacking Houthis in Yemen, and so we are already involved to somewhat. But what prevents this from becoming a war like you see in Ukraine and Russia is the fact that they know that the U.S. would defend Israel. And they don't want to get Hezbollah, Iran, they don't want to get into a war with the United States. So I expect something where you're going to see something at least that overwhelms the system so that they get some missiles through or drones or whatever they do. And Israel will respond. And the response I see is, again, some kind of response where, again, it doesn't escalate things even more, but probably more in Lebanon in particular. I wouldn't be surprised if they strike the airport after this, the runway, for example, or infrastructure, roads, and certainly more terrorist leaders. And you're going to see this, I think, as we go forward, these kind of peaks, and it'll go down a bit, and again, a peak, and it'll go down. But that is this kind of drumbeat of a war that we are in until a ceasefire is reached.
Just on the subject of terrorist leaders, Hagar, before we let you go, Yahya Sinwar has now been named the political leader of Hamas after the former political leader was assassinated in an Israeli strike that was blamed on Israel in Tehran. How concerning is that, or is this just giving him another title with power he already had?
Yes, I'm excited you asked this question because I can really nerd out about it. Because Yahya Sinwar, who is currently cowering in a tunnel in Gaza while his people are dying and starving, he is the one who was really the mastermind behind October 7 and is very much a hardliner, very much in line with Iran and Iran's goals across the region, has no shred of mercy in him whatsoever. And he was up for the role against Khalid Mashal. Khalid Mashal is another one of the Hamas leaders who's living in the lap of luxury in Doha. And the fact that Khalid Mashal wasn't chosen says a lot, because Khalid Mashal has been on the outs a little bit with Iran for the last 10 years. And that was because when the Syria war started a decade ago, Khalid Mashal was living in Syria, and he left because he was so against what President Bashar al-Assad was doing to his people. And yet Syria, the Syrian government, was allied with Iran. And so after that, they were a little bit on the outs. And while they're all ugly, I mean, we're talking about ranking thugs here. Khalid Mashal was, if you will, the lesser of the hardliners. He was the one, he wanted to make a deal, for example, with the Palestinian Authority and Mahmoud Abbas. That's not something that Yahya Sinwar wants. Now, so that's what it means, the fact that he was chosen. At the same time, one thing I'll say, the last point, is that ceasefire talks have been frozen because of the assassination against Ismail Haniyeh in Iran. However, Yahya Sinwar was the one negotiating anyway. And so I just expect those ceasefire talks to resume at a certain point soon.
All right, Hagar Chemali, it's always great to hear from you, and we love the nerdy. Founder and CEO of Greenwich Media Strategy. Thank you so much for joining us. And coming up, we'll take a look at the escalating attacks between the two political campaigns here in the U.S. and the use of the word weird. Here's what J.D. Vance had to say about that Democratic messaging from Wisconsin this afternoon.
I think that the weird argument honestly came from a bunch of 24-year-old social media interns who were bullied in school, and they decided they're going to project that onto the entire Trump campaign.
Our political panel will be with us to discuss after the break. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I just wanted to check out my future plane, but I also wanted to go say hello to the vice president and ask her why Kamala Harris why does she refuse to answer questions from the media? And I also thought that the press gaggle following her might get a little lonely.
That was Republican vice presidential nominee Senator J.D. Vance earlier today on a tarmac that he shared with Air Force Two as both campaigns took their case to voters in Wisconsin. Welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Joining us now is our political panel, Lauren Tomlinson, Cornerstone Public Affairs Principal, and Alvin Jordan, Democratic Strategist. So I'm not sure what either of you think about the tactic of walking to Air Force Two just to address the press and see if they have any questions for you. But Alvin, he is making a point about the fact that Kamala Harris has not frequently spoken off the cuff with the press in the last few weeks. She's obviously on the trail. She's hitting the swing states, as we're seeing today with Tim Walz, now that she's chosen him. But is reading the teleprompter at these rallies enough, or does she got to sit down for some interviews?
I think it's enough right now. I've kind of quietly applauded their, kind of stick to the trust the process, at least seemingly trust the process approach, which has, I think, allowed them to just introduce themselves to the kind of broader American public in that way. I think Vice President Harris yesterday did a good job of, kind of quickly reminding the rally attendees that I just received, kind of this news that I was running for president, as a reminder, not so long ago. And I think in that way, they're kind of playing from their position in a way that I think is advantageous in the sense that I think when they do start having those interviews that kind of give a little bit more insight as to their plans, it won't be too late, and people will at that point, I think, kind of have a better understanding as far as, where they're coming from.
Well, as for J.D. Vance today, walking across the tarmac, it was a little bit of a dog caught the car moment. If we kept rolling that tape, you would then hear a press corps that had no questions for him. He just stood there and kind of walked back over to his airplane. Maybe not the most thought-out maneuver here. If you're with us on Bloomberg TV, you see the staff marching across the runway, but it kind of led to nothing, Lauren. Is there strategy, smart strategy behind him essentially matching this new ticket city for city? He's going to be showing up where they are tomorrow again?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's this is why Trump chose J.D. Vance, right? Like, now it all kind of makes sense. He's going out and he is bracketing every single event that Harris is having. Importantly, in the Midwestern states, which we already know, like you can tell by Walz's choice, as VP, like this is where the game is. These are the voters that matter. And so communicating to them. And I think interestingly, too, as a communicator, it was great to see him make the play towards the local journalists when he was doing his press conferences today, because he is actively trying to engage and engage the undecided voters, engage those locals, because, again, this is going to be one of those races that's down to the wire. It's decided by 40,000, 20,000 people in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. And so him going out and actively engaging in these conversations, I think, is really smart.
Well, it is just him, though. This is Harris and Walz on the trail together jointly as a ticket versus just J.D. Vance out there following them around. Donald Trump is only going to be seen in Montana this week, we understand. But he is doing some media appearances as his own. He actually called into Fox and Friends this morning, talking about the likelihood of a debate between him and Harris.
I don't know how she debates. I heard she's sort of a nasty person, but not a good good debater. But we'll see, because we'll be debating her, I guess, in the pretty near future. It's going to be announced fairly soon, but we'll be debating her. She doesn't want to debate. She wants to say, I don't want to debate, but I do want to debate.
So, Lauren, the vice president says she does want to debate on ABC on September 10th, as originally agreed. Donald Trump was floating September 4th on Fox, but he does seem pretty confident here. He will be sharing a stage with her at some point. Do you believe it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it's obvious that he was telegraphing that there's some sort of negotiations going on with the amongst the campaigns and the network, since we're not using the Presidential Debate Commission anymore, which is great. They need to have a debate. And I think this is also something that the Trump campaign, with all of their messaging towards, Kamala needs to do an interview. We need to see the vice president do more media interviews. The debate will serve this purpose as well. They're trying to catch her off teleprompter because she's doing great when she's on message on teleprompter. They're trying to trip her up in some of those moments that they can exploit. And the debate, in theory, would give them that.
Interesting that we're going back to this, the half-an-hour phone call, the magical mystery tour with Donald Trump. It really brought back some memories this morning. He said a lot of things in that interview. Alvin, what do you think? Do you want to see Kamala Harris share a stage with him? Does that need to happen?
1,000%. It has to happen. And I think on some level, the former president also wants that. And I think that he just can't help himself as to, how we get to that point. And I think we even saw some of this play out at the NABJ from this past week, where he was, kind of making the point that he wasn't late, but the equipment wasn't working, and there was word that he was trying to get maybe some of the fact checking removed from the interview. And so I just think that this is just the way that Trump operates.
Will he say
in
all
the
of that
sense
stuff to her face that he said at the NABJ?
Well, I think his team has to be completely afraid that will kind of play out that way, which I think will do them more harm than good. And so on the one hand, where, just a few weeks ago, the talk of debate, I think, had Democrats, just had us looking, very
scarred by
just afraid. And I think that, the roles have been switched in the sense that, to Lauren's point, as far as going by the script, it's been working, as hoped.
Well, on the subject of not going by the script, we also saw Donald Trump recently in Georgia over the weekend, where he attacked a very popular governor, Brian Kemp. I thought they had mended these fences, perhaps not. Then you see Sabato's crystal ball today, changing the rankings of 3 states, including Minnesota and New Hampshire, they now see as likely D. Georgia becomes a toss-up. Lauren, should you be attacking the governor of Georgia if it's a toss-up?
No, I think this is where J.D. Vance's message is. You can see he's doing what the Republicans in the campaign really want, which is sticking it to the policy, right, and making that policy case against the Democrats. Every time that Biden has these sort of personal grievances and other things, it infuriates the party. It infuriates moderate voters. Brian Kemp is a very popular governor. He's done great things for Georgia. He handled COVID amazingly. He's brought a lot of business to Georgia. So attacking a popular governor, not exactly a winning strategy, especially when they're in the same, party as you. So this is why I think it's incumbent that Donald Trump and his campaign managers are going to be spending a lot of time thinking back on why 2020 wasn't successful and remembering what messages did work. And if this can be a referendum on Biden's policies, on Kamala Harris's policies, and where Americans feel they are right now today, so sticking to the policies, then Trump does well. If Trump makes this a personality contest and a lot of these grievances can continue to come up and he gets off message in that regard, people are going to be reminded why they didn't want to vote for him in 2020.
Our panel will stay with us coming up ahead with Alvin and Lauren. We'll take a look at the lessons that we can learn from the defeat of Congresswoman Cori Bush in Missouri on primary night last night. Another member of the squad dispatched by voters. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This district is ready for better and more accountable representation in Washington, D.C. Progressives should actually make progress. And that's what I've done my entire career.
That was Wesley Bell. Remember that name, the Democratic candidate for Missouri's 1st congressional district yesterday following his victory in the primary over incumbent Congresswoman Cori Bush. Back with us, our political panel, Lauren Tomlinson and Alvin Jordan. Alvin, this is a second member of the squad, as we call them, to lose in a primary fight. What does it mean for the other members, including Ilhan Omar, next week?
I've actually been looking at these kind of, on an individual basis as opposed to kind of, I know it's easy to lump them in, but I thought this was a case different than Jamal Bowman in New York. I thought this was one where it truly seemed like it was a connective tissue that was, generated as opposed to, just a difference of opinion. And I thought that he, last night was victorious for the simple fact that he seemed to have a better, I think, just grasp of what the community and districts were looking for. And I know there's much to be said about the, kind of funds that were kind of pumped into the campaign. And, you have to mention those. But I just think that this one was a little bit different than, previous primaries. And I thought that it was a result, honestly, of just a different direction of the people there in Missouri and St. Louis and the surrounding areas and kind of what they were looking to do differently than, a few years ago.
Mm-hmm. Lauren, we just have a minute left, but the money, a lot of it came from AIPAC. How much of a factor is it going to be in the general?
Money always makes a difference in politics. But I think, like you were saying, all politics end up being local. Mm-hmm. So it really boils down to, it's easy to say, that the money maybe like shifted voters' minds. It's not. It's the fact that people care that if their member gets a little too focused on national media, national issues, and they're not taking care of them back home, they're going to kick them out. And that's across party lines. So I think that's the biggest takeaway, like you were saying, Alvin. It really is comes down to the local vote.
Well, we'll be seeing how the locals vote in Minnesota in that Omer primary next week. Lauren Tomlinson and Alvin Jordan, our political panel this evening. Thank you so much for joining us. And for more coverage, check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online.
Thanks for being with us on the Wednesday edition of Balance of Power. See you back here tomorrow on Bloomberg TV and Radio.